The first time I laid eyes on Terry Lennox, he was drunk in a Rolls-Royce Silver Wraith outside the Terrace of the Dancers. The parking lot attendant had brought the car out, and he was still holding the door open because Terry Lennox's left foot was still dangling outside, as if he had forgotten he had one. He had a young-looking face, but his hair was bone white. You could tell by his eyes that he was plastered to the hairline, but otherwise he looked like any other nice young guy in a dinner jacket who had been spending too much money in a joint that exists for that purpose and for no other.
You're 16. It's 1976. You're in your older brother's panel van with shag carpet. It has quadraphonic sound. Your mind will never be the same.
Your brother's friends are passing around a small burning stick that you are fairly sure is marijuana, but not completely sure is marijuana.
Because it smells sort of like musty laundry. Right.
Is that what marijuana smells like? You're not sure. You think you've smelled it at some point before, but you're not. There's no way to prove it. What are you going to do?
It could just be oregano that somebody dropped on the floor and vacuumed up.
You've heard that this is a scam that some other people in high school have fallen for, smoking oregano, and you are not going to fall for this same trap. But you are mysteriously distracted by the sound that is coming out of the stereo.
All 4 speakers in the panel van, each one playing a slightly different mix. This stuff writes itself.
I know.
Man. You know what I think we should do? But we're gonna talk about Raymond Chandler's The Long Goodbye. But this is the beginning of season 3. We very rarely say who we are, and I think we should do it once a season.
You know, that's a good point. So
who are you?
I am Chris Bagg.
And I am Jesse Dukes. And together we host this podcast, which is
Upper Middlebrow. And what is Upper Middlebrow, Jesse?
Upper Middlebrow is a podcast about books or movies where you and I talk, sometimes with other people. We go into tremendous depth about the craft, but we're not snobby about it. And we think that good books ought to be enjoyed by everybody, and that we think that even entertaining books meant for wide audiences should be crafty. Mm-hmm. And we think that crafty books that are meant to be literary should be entertaining. And we talk about why they aren't those things. How's that?
Yeah, that's good. We're like the gunslingers of the literary world. You know,
Tell me more about that.
Yeah, you know, we're not going to be really uppity about books. We're not going to have our definitions like totally nailed or totally grooved. We know what we're talking about.
I see what you mean. Gunslingers, metaphorically. I was like, we're going to kill Tom Clancy and then die at age 31?
Exactly. Yes. It's going to be like the end of Young Guns 2.
Right. I didn't see Young Guns 2, but I know my history around Billy the Kid.
I know my history around 1990s semi-blockbusters that also feature soundtracks by
Bon Jovi.
Okay. I was going towards Poison, and I was like, I don't think that's right.
Anyway, though, I was proposing that we unveil our new faster format,
which I am clearly
which
desperately
completely failing at,
working it under
sort of torpedoing right now. But we have introduced ourselves. Yes. We have introduced the show. So why don't we recap
the first
The Long
half
Goodbye of Raymond Chandler.
Of Raymond Chandler's The Long Goodbye.
This one is one where we're going to have to skip some details because there are a lot of details. So we're going to focus on the 2 main threads of the plot, and even then, there's going to be a lot. But our protagonist is Philip Marlowe. He's a private detective in Los Angeles in late 40s, early 50s, and he befriends Terry Lennox, who he finds one evening drunk and more or less passed out in L.A., abandoned by his date. Turns out to be his ex-wife and future wife. And Marlowe and Lennox become friends. Lennox is kind and polite, and he has a terrible alcohol abuse problem. He also has scars and white hair, probably related to some kind of injury sustained in World War II. And they become friends for a while, and then Lennox is in real trouble at one point. Marlowe helps him out, but a few weeks later, he remarries Sylvia, and his circumstances seem to improve. Certainly, he now has money. However, just a few months after that, Lennox shows up at Marlowe's house at 5 a.m. in trouble, asking for a ride to the Tijuana airport.
And Marlowe helps, but he's very careful to kind of make sure that Lennox doesn't really tell him anything specific.
He doesn't want to be accessory after the fact.
Yeah, he doesn't want to know any details because then it could be proved that he knew some of this stuff. But Lennox is about to get on the plane. He implies that he murdered Sylvia. It does turn out that Sylvia is dead. Marlowe gets questions. He's held in custody by the cops. There's sort of this like bizarre parade of different shitty cops. And Marlowe refuses to cooperate. He spends a few days in jail. He's confronted by a mysterious lawyer who might be working for Sylvia's father and a gangster who claims to be a war buddy of Lennox. There's insults, violence, and sometimes actual violence in this section. Marlowe gets released due to some political pressure from the district attorney, who is like probably trying to cover something up because Sylvia Lennox's dad is a very rich newspaperman. Marlowe gets word that Lennox confessed to the murder and killed himself, but there is no evidence about actually a confession or a body that killed itself.
Right. Right. We have to take our word on the authorities that both the body and the confession exists. We should say too that like Marlowe seldom interacts with anybody without insulting that person, being insulted by that person, being intimidated by that person, trying to intimidate that person. There are like 2 exceptions to that. But for the most part, every conversation he has is a kind of confrontation with a certain amount of aggression. Although sometimes those go okay and the 2 people decide. There'll often be a moment where it's like, you're all right, Marlowe.
Yeah. All right, chum, I pushed you around enough, and you seem like a good gam. All right, let's talk.
You seem like a gam. Let's have a gimlet. But anyway, not too long after all this, Marlowe gets hired by Eileen Wade through sort of Eileen Wade is the wife of an author named Roger Wade. It's the publisher who originally approaches him, but Marlowe realizes it's Eileen who is behind this. Roger Wade also has an alcohol abuse problem, like pretty much everybody in this book.
Yeah.
After some adventures, he finds Wade at this kind of informal rehab facility. Very bizarre scene. Takes him home. Makes a pass at Eileen once he gets her husband safely home. The pass is rebuffed, although she still seems, she's grateful and maybe is like a little bit interested in him romantically. So Marlowe is still suspicious of Lennox's confessions, though, and he meets a woman named Linda Loring, who turns out to be the late Sylvia Lennox's sister, the murdered woman's sister. She knew Terry, of course, they were in-laws, and is like maybe open to the suggestion that Lennox is innocent of the murder, but then she gets angry when Marlowe suggests her father, again, Harlan, what's his name?
Harlan Potter.
Harlan Potter helped pin the murder on Lennox.
Marlowe heads off to a party at the Wades. He is invited to go there by Eileen Wade and Roger Wade.
Roger likes him too.
There's a drama between Dr. Loring, who is Linda's husband, and Roger Wade. After Roger Wade has kind of offered Marlowe a job, he offers him $1,000 a week to stay at the Wade's estate in Idle Valley. Just the place names are just the best. And I suspect real.
Many of them are real, yep.
And Wade wants to hire Marlowe to kind of keep him on the straight and narrow so he can get this book finished that he is working on.
Basically, keep him off the sauce.
Yeah.
Off the pepper. Even off the juice.
As Wade is like desperately pressuring Marlowe to have a drink with him.
Yeah. Yeah. Wade stays sober for about a day after his bender.
Yeah.
So Marlowe turns him down, but a few days later he gets a call from Wade, and Wade sounds badly off. So Marlowe drives out to their place. Wade has a head injury, and Eileen is behaving oddly, doesn't seem concerned about Wade's head injury. Marlowe, along with the Latino houseboy Candy, after some more confrontation, they get Wade in bed, get him cleaned up, and then Wade says something vague about think he says, like, have you ever killed anybody, Marlowe? And then he says, I've got some stuff I wrote down that I don't want Eileen to see. And that pretty much ends our section.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it's a nice section to pick because, well, I mean, like it ends on a cliffhanger, but almost every chapter ends on a cliffhanger. I don't know if you saw, I abandoned it, but I was sort of putting together a poem that used the final sentence of every. It just didn't. I was like, this isn't going to work.
There's some moments there. Yeah, but. They're often either a cliffhanger or a kicker of some kind.
Yeah, there's always he
uses his chapter ends to effect.
Yeah,
like
for sure.
There's always something in the air. And I would also say, like, we probably should have said this during the recap, but this book is set in a world full of toxic masculinity. There is sexism, there is racism, some of which is espoused by the protagonist, who one might think of as, he's not an author insert, but it's entirely possible that Chandler is putting the sexism and the racism uncritically in there. It's not necessarily ironic. So, if you read this, there's some hurtful language and there's some hurtful moments that we have to be aware of.
Yeah, you get the feeling that Chandler is kind of comfortably complicit in this era's manner of talking about things. And I've got a question later on about...
Although sometimes he punctures it a little bit. Like, that there are moments where he deliberately... punctures a prejudice or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I thought we might want to start because we did get a question during our draft about what is noir anyway? And I was like, you know what? That's not a bad place to start. So I was thinking about it a little bit, and let me know if you think that this is accurate or if there's other stuff to add. But noir stories are ones where usually the mechanisms of the plot kind of outmatch the protagonist, who usually gets kind of overwhelmed by the complicated systems that are arrayed against him or her. The protagonist usually gets themselves into hot water, which noir shares with tragedy, because the reason that they get into hot water is because they just kind of can't help themselves. They feel drawn to do things that are not in their best interest. And the first few chapters of the book, Marlowe keeps saying things like that. The next time I see a white-haired drunk falling out of a silver wraith, I'm going to walk the other way as fast as I can.
She was right, of course, dead right.
Yeah.
And if I had believed her then, that might have avoided a whole hell of a lot of trouble.
And then, but in noir, like the hero has a little bit more hidden from them in tragedy. Very often in tragedy, the person who goes through the downfall tends to know what is coming and is trying to head it off, and usually in the trying to head it off encourages it. In noir, though, it's a lot more mysterious. And what that does is that places us alongside the protagonist as they try to unravel the mystery before it unravels them. I would say that noir is kind of darker, less sympathetic, and crueler than traditional whodunits.
Yeah, for sure. I think two other elements that you sort of alluded to, but in detective noir... The character, you alluded to this, but often the protagonist doesn't follow the rules of their station. So a detective is supposed to be, law-abiding. And often the noir detectives get tangled up in whatever they're doing in such a way that they start breaking the law. There's also criminal noir, and often where the criminals sort of like become too sentimental for their own good. And then I think the other thing I would also add to that is that there's an element of tragedy, although often the protagonist survives. Often the tragedy happens to somebody who the protagonist is trying to save. And sometimes there's a redemptive ending, or there's a mixed ending, right? That it might be tragic for this person, but somebody else is saved or something like that. So as a reader, it's not like Oedipus Rex, where you know where this is going necessarily. Like there is some hope. And I think that hope allows you to stay engaged in the plot and to try to figure out what's going on. And it's, it can propel you through the story, because maybe things will turn out all right. Maybe Marlowe is going to figure out who really killed Sylvia and get Lennox off the hook. We're rooting for him. And I think often with noir, you have the quality of somebody who is both sympathetic but also has to kind of become part of the corrupt system in order to fight it.
Yeah.
And that's definitely the case with this book.
You got a question here about justice. What hit me?
Yeah. Well,
hit me, boss.
Actually, there was a
slug me.
When we were talking about Neuromancer, you read an essay and somebody defined noir as starting with a deficit of justice. And if that is the case, where is the deficit of justice here?
Yeah. Well,
because, from what we can see, a man committed a murder and the cops caught him and he's dead. Mm-hmm. So on the surface, justice has been done.
So I have an argument as I was reading this that this is a populist novel. The forces that are arrayed against each other are large groups of less powerful people that are arrayed against a few small groups of more powerful people. And the police are kind of in the middle. There's a few sympathetic cops and there's a few really bad cops, but the cops don't really know what's going on. And they are generally beholden to the people that are in power above that. And that might be the district attorney or Harlan Potter. And so the deficit of justice here, I think we are being made to believe, because it's a detective novel, so there has to be a degree of misdirection kind of going on. I think the deficit of justice that is being set up is that Terry Lennox didn't kill Sylvia Lennox, and he is being set up to take the fall for his wife's death. Maybe by his father... maybe by his father-in-law, maybe by other forces that we haven't even seen yet. But the deficit of justice is that Terry Lennox isn't getting his day in court. And there's a lot that is kind of obfuscating even his attempts, because you get the sense that Lennox just wants to get away. And he writes a letter to Marlowe from Mexico, and we're not sure if it's pre-suicide / murder by the Mexican cops. It certainly couldn't be post, but it also could be that he's not dead. And so there are forces that are keeping Terry Lennox's justice at bay. And Marlowe is kind of racing to fix that before he is kind of caught up in the maelstrom of those powers that are bigger than him to begin with. So I think that's the deficit of justice. Do you see a different one?
I mean, I agree with that one. I think there's an even deeper... I think it begins even prior to Terry Lennox being set up. I think it's in the very first page. That Terry Lennox is a war hero who essentially... nowadays we'd say he has untreated PTSD.
Yeah, totally.
And no way to make a living.
Yeah.
And, the first thing we see is that, Sylvia is an interesting character. She does seem to have some genuine regard. She's this rich woman, but she abandons him because he's drinking and semi passed out. And also she abandons him when she learns that he had to pawn his very nice car and they can't take a trip to Montecito, which is a cold thing to do. But we also get the sense that he's been erratic and a pain. But there's I think the injustice is the injustice that a lot of veterans would have been experiencing in the early 1950s, which is you went to war, you did what you asked us to do, and now you need help and you're not getting any. And I think Terry Lennox stands in for that. And he is a nice guy in a world of not very nice people. And I think that's why Marlowe instinctively wants to help him. I think that's why Marlowe is also, for all his toughness, hugely sentimental and has a huge sense of outraged justice. And you see it in other little examples too. So I think you're absolutely right that what's happening to Terry Lennox, apparently, we don't know. Lennox might have beaten his wife to death, but even prior to that, I think the way that the broader world is treating him is the broader injustice. And I think that's where starts this whole thing off.
I think that's where I arrive at that populist reading. That this novel feels like a class. It feels like a battle between the classes, and like all of the sort of lower class characters are sort of striving. Even one of our sort of kingpin gangsters is like was in the foxhole with Lennox when he, basically jumped on a grenade and like tried to, save his buddies and ended up being traumatized and disfigured. So like, and that gangster is a part of the power structures. He crows about his money. He crows about his power. We're not quite sure if we're supposed to like him or not. Marlowe kind of like you've said already, through kind of a little bit of a confrontation, gets him to be like, "You're all right, Marlowe." But no one is as nefarious as the unseen Harlan Potter.
Yeah.
This literally off-scene power broker who seems to be pulling the strings, and that's why it feels like this populist novel of like, it's not really people versus power, but I think you can see what I'm gesturing at.
Yeah. And I also think it's not just that the rich people and the gangsters and the corrupt cops are bad and the little guy is good, because we've seen decent examples of cops. We've seen decent rich people. We've even seen Mendy Menendez as kind of like a decent gangster in a way, in that at least, even though he's very aggressive towards Marlowe, he is trying to help Terry Lennox, or was at one point. And it is. I mean, it's too simple to say that the system is oppressive, but I also think there's this sense of an oppressive force at work that transcends a particular class or transcends a particular, and that, we haven't met Harlan Potter yet, but I imagine that he's a stand-in for something, that there's sort of allegory going on here.
Yeah. Of the, like, the forces that keep this particular world cramped, hot, dangerous, ugly, and bitter.
Yeah.
Which are basically the words that I would use to kind of sum up the mood or atmosphere of this. Mm-hmm. Like, it feels constrained. And like, Marlowe is always in these sort of like tight spaces, and the places where the prose opens up is when he's not. Like, we finally get some like lyrical stuff when he's like driving up to the Wades.
Well, what's funny too is that, like, from my perspective, he's living in paradise, right? Like, it's like everything that's great about Southern California now without the traffic. Like, you can actually get places, and like beautiful classical bars like Victor's and Musso and Frank's, and like, these classic Hollywood mansions. Like, it's funny, but anything can be corrupt depending on who inhabits it. Mm-hmm.
My next question for you, like, we know this is, we know that Chandler and The Long Goodbye and a lot of these books have been like widely admired for decades. What do you feel elevates it? What do you think is getting this off of the, what is getting us out of the lower strata of pulp?
Okay, I think of three things. One is, even though sometimes he pushes them too far, Chandler's analogies are wonderful. But they're also, you could see why his writing is satirized, because there are a lot of similes, and it's just like, there's probably a few too many, and you turn them up and you get these similes like, a dame walked into the office, her legs went all the way to Jupiter and back, and you're like, she had the kind of face that one would volunteer to get machine gunned in the Sorbonne just for a chance to see on a nurse's face. Like, they're a little bit elaborate, and yet for the most part they're reined in and they're good and they're specific. So, master of analogy. I also think like this is a writer who has to a lesser degree the same skill set as Hemingway and Fitzgerald of being able to create these sort of tragic, yearning characters without being explicit about what's tragic and yearning, forcing you. There's a certain amount of Hemingway's iceberg theory going on, and in particular with Marlowe, because Marlowe is wry and cynical and bitter, but what you never hear articulated by his internality. You hear what he doesn't like about the world around him all the time, but you don't hear what he hopes for and what he does want. But one starts to sense this man is a real idealist. And there's that poor husband whose wife goes off to Hawaii. It's this little side story who he basically helps and more or less helps at cost.
Yeah.
And you can sort of, and I even think like with Wade, he doesn't charge the Wades any money for his services. Like deep down, Marlowe just wants to help people, and he's in this corrupt world, and he has this tough guy front, and we haven't really. I mean, he's done a little violence, but one senses that like in a violent world, he can hold his own. He's kind of a John Wayne like character in that respect. Like he's got to be violent because the world is violent in order to make the world safer. But I think that Marlowe's sympathetic qualities are not explicit and kind of beautifully laid out in a way that the reader has to compile them together into a portrait. So I think that's one of...
Okay, so similes, and then your second thing is that it's very tasteful. Like Marlowe's objectives, the framing of his objectives are really tasteful, and we get to see them. Yeah,
it's idealism without... overwrought language of idealism. It's implied idealism. It's iceberg idealism. And so that's two. And then I think the third, there is a pretty like taut prose style, just like a spare, even though I think an editor could cut about a quarter of the words of this book, but still for the most part, the sentences are pretty good. Actually, it's not even the words. It's that the complaint I would have is that too many of I just think there's just too much plot. He meets too many people. Yeah. There's too many cops that threaten him. There's too many gangsters, too many lawyers. There's just, and all of after a while, those confrontations he has just really start feeling like a variation of the same thing. Yeah. And I could do with maybe a third less. I think, but I do think the writing in general is deliciously sparse, with just a few details, analogies, and things like that. So those are my three.
Yeah, I think like what you're saying about the sentences, like the sentences maybe go on too long, but the words are great. Like I think he's such a master of like the transitive verb, like the verb that is actually doing something to something else, and oh my God, so many past participles. So many like shaped or laid or stuff like that, like where what looks like a verb is actually acting like an adjective. And it gives the prose this kind of like brick-like authority. Like it feels...
That's an interesting observation.
It just feels so solid.
Yeah.
And
do you have an example?
I do. I kind of want to give you two options. Either the opening of chapter 23, when he is driving out to the Wades for the first time. I think that's like a really nice one. Or the first couple paragraphs of the book. I think either of those would be good. Do any of those?
Your choice. I remember the first couple paragraphs pretty well. I don't remember that scene from the Wades.
Let's go with the first couple paragraphs then. I think that this is, why not?
Yeah.
The first time I laid eyes on Terry Lennox, he was drunk in a Rolls-Royce Silver Wraith outside the Terrace of the Dancers. The parking lot attendant had brought the car out, and he was still holding the door open because Terry Lennox's left foot was still dangling outside, as if he had forgotten he had one. He had a young-looking face, but his hair was bone white. You could tell by his eyes that he was plastered to the hairline, but otherwise he looked like any other nice young guy in a dinner jacket who had been spending too much money in a joint that exists for that purpose and for no other. There was a girl beside him. Her hair was a lovely shade of dark red, and she had a distant smile on her lips, and over her shoulders she had a blue mink that almost made the Rolls-Royce look like just another automobile. It didn't quite. Nothing can.
It's good, and I hear what you mean about the sentence being too long, except for which was made for that purpose and none other. Is it, if you're going to have an extra clause, like that's the right one. And you know what, I'll add a fourth thing, which is just a real quality of observation. Sort of like that Steinbeck thing, where he'll just sort of tell you his view of something, and you're like, this is risky, except for that's spot on. I recognize that. I actually want to, well, do you want to talk about that? I want to give you a reading back.
No, give me a reading back. I love it.
This is just out of pure admiration. So
this is just more fodder for like sentence analysis.
I was just saving analogies, similes, and metaphors. Here are a couple. The road north is as monotonous as a sailor's shanty. Nobody at the border gate looked at me, as if my face meant as much as the hands on a clock. He let me see the glint of a badge. For all I caught of it, he might have been pest control. Just all great.
So good. Yeah.
But here's the actual reading. Those were just little notes I had. Okay, so this is prior to the murder, sort of midway through. This is one of the times where Lennox and Marlowe go out drinking and sort of share wry commentary about the world. We were drinking gimlets again. The place was almost empty. There was the usual light scattering of compulsive drinkers getting tuned up at the bar on the stools, the kind that reach very slowly for the first one and watch their hands so they won't knock anything over. I don't get that. Am I supposed to? Big production, no story, as they say around the movie lots. I guess Sylvia is happy enough, though not necessarily with me. In our circle, that's not too important. There's always something to do if you don't have to work or consider the cost. It's no real fun, but the rich don't know that. They never had any. They never want anything very hard except maybe somebody else's wife, and that's a pretty pale desire compared with the way a plumber's wife wants new curtains for the living room. I didn't say anything. I let him carry the ball. Mostly I just kill time, he says. And it dies hard. A little tennis, a little golf, a little swimming and horseback riding, and the exquisite pleasure of watching Sylvia's friends try to hold out to lunchtime before they start killing their hangovers. The night you went to Vegas, she said she didn't like drunks. He grinned crookedly. I was getting so used to his scarred face that I only noticed it when some change of expression emphasized its one-sided woodenness. She meant drunks without money. With money, they're just heavy drinkers. If they vomit on the lanai, that's for the butler to handle.
Like, just the world is always coming out of the words, like
the world. And then, but we're also, but we're also getting character at the same. It reminds me of that Margaret Atwood passage, where she meant drunks without money. With money, they're just heavy drinkers. I mean, that's like what's his name? That's like, I'm trying to remember the name of a cranky journalist from that period, but I'm drawing a blank. But that's like it's like a Mark Twain level of observation.
A.J. Liebling does stuff like that.
A.J. Liebling. There was another writer I'm thinking of, but A.J. Liebling would say something like that. Also, they never want anything very hard except maybe somebody else's wife, and that's a pretty pale desire compared with the way a plumber's wife wants new curtains for the living room. Which is great, but also there's a certain amount of compassion and empathy for the idle rich here, too. They're unhappy, too, and they are sort of part of the system. Sure, they have it maybe a little bit better. I think there's a moment where Terry Lennox says, happiness, hell. Who wants to be happy? I want to be rich or something like that. So it's like, sure, the rich have it better, but only a little bit, really. Yeah,
this is not a nice world. Like, the world of noir is not, and that's what makes those passages where he's like actually out in the sunlight, like really feel like, oh, thank God, I could breathe again. But it is like, it's
even just the eucalyptus trees whispering across the street in his Laurel Canyon house, and the redwood steps. Or there's a moment where he's in San Diego and he's like, San Diego, an absolutely beautiful harbor, except for all that's there is some Navy ships and fishing boats. And poor old Marlowe has to get back home to polish the spoons or something like count the spoons. It's like the world is beautiful, but nobody has time for it. You get that sense a lot of the time.
Yeah, because everybody is trying to keep their head above water. And that's like the pressure of noir. is that like everybody's hard up, and like the number of times that Marlowe is described as like a smallie, and like a small time.
What is Menendez call him? Cheapy.
Cheapy. That's right.
Cheapy.
Keeps calling him Cheapy.
Until Marlowe finally punches him in the stomach. Yeah. Which is, I think, the only time Marlowe loses his temper, right? Like, I mean...
Sure, but even that is calculated. Like even the blow to the gut, like, because I think Marlowe describes how he kind of is getting closer to Menendez. So like even Marlowe's moments of violence,
he's sort of showing him that he's not to be pushed around.
Yeah. It's another great, like, it's a great comparison with John Wayne. Because like John Wayne characters are always in control of themselves, like except for the few. The handful of times where he isn't, and that's an important part of the narrative as well.
Yeah.
So let's see. You've got a question about the inciting incident here.
Yeah. What's the inciting incident of this novel?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, like in noir, very often the inciting incident is, like the door to my office opened at 4:30. I had already been headed to the shelf to pick up my bottle of bourbon, and when she walked in, I put it back down with a clink, like that kind of, like usually that's what we get in noir. I think. But
even with those stories, though, there's often a moment where the detective actually decides to help.
Yeah.
A lot of times, like, well, I don't know, I'll check it out for you, but I don't expect much. There's often a sort of 20 pages of hedging and poking around before our character's drawn in.
I'm gonna toss out that moment from No Country for Old Men, the movie, where Josh Brolin's character knows that there is a suitcase full of money in the desert, and he knows he shouldn't go get it. And there is a shot of him lying next to his like beautiful pregnant wife, and he looks up at the camera and he says, "Okay." And
isn't it he has the suitcase, but he chooses to go back and help the man who's dying of give the guy some water?
Yes, that's right. Well, like, he makes the decision regardless.
Right.
He makes the decision that he should not make just because of who he is. And I think the inciting incident is in the first few pages of the book when Marlowe decides to help Terry Lennox. And like, you kind of get the feeling that he shouldn't. The valet tries to talk him out of it, the car attendant. And Marlowe can't. He can't help himself.
I don't disagree, because I think this book has a number of moments like that.
Yeah.
But for me, the epic one, and it's actually very similar to your Josh Brolin example, is when Marlowe has driven him to Tijuana and he's about to get on the plane. And I actually have the reading here. He's about to get on the plane and Marlowe says, "Climb aboard," I said. "I know you didn't kill her. That's why I'm here." He braced himself. His whole body got stiff. He turned slowly, then looked back. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "but you're wrong about that. I'm going to walk quite slowly to the plane. You have plenty of time to stop me." He walked. I watched him. And basically, Marlowe lets him get on the plane. And up to that point, Marlowe still has his plausible deniability, right? At that point, he doesn't anymore. That's the moment where Marlowe breaks the law. And I think that's actually the inciting incident. Because you could also say the murder is the inciting incident. But I think that's the moment where Marlowe is committed. Like, I think up until now, Marlowe could avoid getting dragged into this. If all Terry Lennox did was get on the plane, Marlowe could go back home and say, yeah, he asked for a plane. He asked me to help him get on the plane, and I did. I have no idea where he's going, but at that point, if he helps, he's accessory to murder. Mm-hmm. And so I actually think that's the moment. But I don't think your answer is wrong. But that I just noticed that's like, okay, now he's in. I think this is a feature of noir, too, which is that there's this sort of entrapment period where the character is dancing around the dangerous situation. And then there's a moment where it's like, the Josh Brolin thing is perfect.
Yeah.
Because I think in that moment he looks up at the sky and he says something like, "There ain't nothing else for it," or something like it's basically like, this is fate.
Yeah. Right.
I have to do this.
Yeah. These the visual that I get of Marlowe and lots of noir protagonists is that they are being dragged to the center of a maelstrom. And where that begins, whether it's on the first page or in chapter 5, is, the important part is the maelstrom,
right.
Right. And I think, I would say that what is definitely not the inciting incident is the murder.
Right.
And this kind of leads into my next question about how do we separate the art from the artist, because this is a book about clearing Terry Lennox's name, not getting justice for Sylvia Lennox, who's literally dispensed with in a pretty gruesome fashion, and terrible. Is treated without any compassion in the first half of the book, and even like some very icky things about like the state of her face after it has been bashed in versus the state of what she looked like before.
Yeah.
And, there are a lot of...
But Marlowe doesn't approve of the murder.
Right.
But what sticks in his craw is that he thinks Lennox is being pinned.
Right. And it's less... And that's sort of the how do we separate the art from the artist here. And I think I've got some ideas, but I was wondering if you have any sort of like moments as you're reading this book.
Like, I'm not going to... No, I hadn't noticed that one. I think I certainly noticed a general sexist quality. Although sometimes there's that moment where Marlowe has a drink with Linda Loring, and he's like, sometimes people can just have a drink without it being about sex.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, and but no, I don't think you can separate it, and I think it's a flaw in the book. I think perhaps you could say this is a flaw that Marlowe has, but I don't think we're invited to view that particularly critically. Mm-hmm. I don't really think you can separate the art from the artist. I think it makes for a flawed book, ultimately, but a book that still has elements that I admire. In the same way, I don't think the kind of internality balance or the quality of understanding what's emotionally at stake for these characters has quite the delicacy of Hemingway or F. Scott Fitzgerald. Mm-hmm. It has a dollop of that, right? And it has more than you would expect from something you would buy at a dime store. Not that we have dime stores anymore.
We have dollar stores where everything in art is $2 now.
Exactly, or $1.25, right? It's hard to call it a $1.25 store, but this is cheap genre literature, and it excels at that. I think the one thing, if you're going to make an argument for why this is still worth reading, I would say without Raymond Chandler, based on this book, you don't get James McBride, mm-hmm. Colson Whitehead, or Walter Mosley, who are three Black American masters of noir, who I think are absolutely brilliant, and I don't think have the same foibles as Raymond Chandler. And so I think, maybe we could ask them that question at some point. But like a lot of things, I think you can read something and recognize it as a product of its time and recognize its virtues while still recognizing the faults. And it's maybe as a white man and a man, it might be a little easier for me because his sexism isn't so... It's not directed at me, right? It doesn't hurt as much viscerally. So maybe if anybody feels that this book's flaws are so strong that they don't wish to read it, I won't argue back against that, Yeah. If I was teaching a writing class and I wanted to assign this book, I think it would be perfectly fair to assign an alternative and say, look, I think you'll get a lot out of reading Raymond Chandler, but if you don't want to, I'm trying to think of, let's read Patricia Highsmith instead.
Totally.
Let's read Strangers on a Train.
You're going to get equally
you will also get
misogyny
and other things. Or like, let's read both of them and then let's read Colson Whitehead. And let's see how this genre has evolved into something that actually has become... This is sort of a protest book, but I think, The Intuitionist is wiser and more cutting in its satire in many respects.
Yeah, I think the art and the artist are very separable. Like I'm putting this in here mostly as like because I think it's a good thought experiment. And I think that for me, like this is a novel about class. And and I definitely, so, okay. I'm going to read this passage about blondes. And I am deeply ambivalent about this passage because I think there's some great writing in it, but I also think it could easily be described as reductive. And I also think that maybe there's some stuff in it that, we could point to as positive. Yeah.
Oh, I know this section. This is I did really like this section.
I felt
maybe I'm going to feminist hell for that. Maybe I have to spend some time in like feminist purgatory, which is like a hot yoga class, for like
I think
40 years.
Yeah, I think I felt I was impressed.
But there is maybe a little bit of feminism in this passage too, right? Like,
it's not all misogyny. There are like. Yeah, so I'm just going to read it. Okay.
Well, let's hear it.
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
So,
I think that's the question, listener. Is this pure misogyny, or is it more than misogyny?
Yeah, help us out. So, there are blondes, and it is almost a joke word nowadays. All blondes have their points, except perhaps the metallic ones who are as blonde as a Zulu under the bleach, and as to disposition, as soft as a sidewalk. There's the small, cute blonde who cheeps and twitters, and the big, statuesque blonde who straight-arms you with an ice blue glare. There's the blonde who gives you the up-from-under look and smells lovely and shimmers and hangs on your arm and is always very tired when you take her home. She makes that helpless gesture and has that goddamned headache, and you would like to slug her except that you are glad you found out about the headache before you invested too much time and money and hope in her. Because the headache will always be there, a weapon that never wears out and is as deadly as the Bravo's rapier or Lucrezia's poison vial. There is the soft and willing and alcoholic blonde who doesn't care what she wears as long as it is mink, or where she goes as long as it is the starlight roof and there is plenty of dry champagne. There is the small, perky blonde who is a little pal and wants to pay her own way and is full of sunshine and common sense and knows judo from the ground up and can toss a truck driver over her shoulder without missing more than one sentence out of the editorial in the Saturday Review. There is the pale, pale blonde with anemia of some non-fatal but incurable type. She is very languid and very shadowy, and she speaks softly out of nowhere, and you can't lay a finger on her because in the first place, you don't want to. And in the second place, she is reading The Wasteland, or Dante in the original, or Kafka, or Kierkegaard, or Study in Provençal. She adores music, and when the New York Philharmonic is playing Hindemith, she can tell you which one of the 6 bass viols come in a quarter of a beat too late. I hear Toscanini can also. That makes 2 of them. And lastly, there is the gorgeous showpiece who will outlast 3 kingpin racketeers and then marry a couple of millionaires at $1 million ahead and end up with a pale rose villa at Cap Antibes, an Alfa Romeo town car complete with pilot and co-pilot, and a stable of shop-worn aristocrats, all of whom she will treat with the affectionate absent-mindedness of an elderly duke saying goodnight to his butler.
It's Stevensonian.
It's like it's Shakespearean. It's like it's Chabanesque. It's like Wallace Stevens. It's like reading poetry that starts somewhere, moves to another image, operates that image to then go to another image, and it builds this kind of like spinning solar system out of this very, like, at first it's a list. And then it becomes an aria.
Well, and if you could boil it down to one sentence, what is the argument of that passage?
Okay.
I have one if you want.
Gosh, I think it starts. See, the thing that makes me ambivalent about this passage is that I think that it starts off with this kind of like all birds are the same, see, like kind of energy, and then it like spills into something bigger than that as these different women have these different characteristics. And as the piece, as it goes on, she is gaining and gaining in power, like as the paragraph proceeds. So I don't think the takeaway message is like all birds are the same. See, I think there is something else happening. What's your reading of the takeaway?
I
of
think
this chapter?
if I had to say what the message was in one sentence, it's people are complex.
Yeah.
And which I think is a feminist message.
Yeah.
But then you also have bits like, she has a headache and has that goddamn headache and you would like to slug her, except that you're glad you found out about the headache before you invested too much time and money, and also the small perky blonde who you don't even want to slug.
Yeah.
And also you can't because she reads Kierkegaard. I mean, so it is full of sexism, and yet ultimately what he's getting at is that people are complex, and you could say blondes are complex and diverse, but you could also say women are complex and diverse, but you can also just say people are complex and diverse and will surprise you. And I ultimately think that's the message of that passage, despite it's like it starts in starts in the sewer in terms of its like tone and messageness, and then like finishes on top of a shiny Olympian peak, like next to a bighorn sheep that's like bleating beautifully.
You know? The woman at the end of this passage is Athena. Is like who has won basically. But you're right, it starts in like incel territory, and the bit about the headache is particularly ugly because the speaker of this particular passage only wants sex from and if he's not going to get sex, doesn't want to invest time and money. And but then it modulates. And who knows, maybe...
And the only reason he's not going to take his frustration out in violence by slugging her is that he's glad to know the information that will save him from wasting time with this particular woman in the future.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'm coming across as a Chandler apologist. I think there's some real problems here, but I think that, we're... The stuff that
I'm not okay with the slugging the headache blonde. That's and I'm not saying that where it goes saves the passage I'm saying it is a passage full of flaws and greatness.
Totally. And I think I mean, like the way we separate the art and the artist is that we don't.
I think it's flawed art, and I think he's a flawed person.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can separate those things, but you can separate the flaws from what's brilliant in your reading and your analysis and your experience of the book. At least I find that I can usually do that. Yeah. There might be certain things where I find it so troubling or so offensive that I can't do it. It doesn't take me there with this particular book. But I also want to acknowledge that like maybe if I were more vulnerable to some of the offensive parts, that might tip the balance for me.
All right, you got a question about fun, and then I think we should go to trivia.
Yeah, simple question. Do you think Raymond Chandler experiences writing this book as fun?
Wow. Gosh. I hope so, but I suspect, given what we know about Chandler's life and how he wrote, that he was a pretty unhappy guy. I hope he found some solace and some joy while he was putting the sentences together.
I mean, I feel like that passage you just read would have been pretty fun to bang out on a Smith Corona.
Oh my God. Yeah, seriously. I hope so. I hope that it gave him some peace, that this isn't, that it's not a similar like cri de coeur that you get the sense that Marlowe is experiencing all the time. Because idealist people usually are responding from a place of like deep injustice.
Yeah.
And so, God, I hope he had some fun with it.
I kind of have to imagine he did. I don't imagine you could get through, even though I agree with you that the general tone is deeply critical of our society and deeply cynical. I sort of feel like it feels like there's enough delight in the moments, in the sentences, that it was sort of a tonic, that writing this was some soothing relief. Do you remember who the host is?
You are.
So trivia.
Yes.
At one point, Marlowe receives in the mail from Terry Lennox in Mexico something he refers to as a portrait of Madison, which turns out to be a $5,000 bill. Now, there really were $5,000 bills. They weren't commonly in circulation. They were mostly used for banks to exchange large amount of currency between banks, and then they were basically discontinued. All denominations above $100 were discontinued in 1969. I imagine because wire transfer technology reached a point where it was no longer necessary. However, if you have a $5,000 bill from the 1950s, you can still exchange it.
You can tender it.
You can tender it.
Yes.
It is still legal tender.
What a great verb and word. I just gotta say.
Yep. So my question for you, though, is what was the largest valued banknote issued by the U.S. Treasury in its history?
I think it is $1 million.
Well, it's multiple choice.
Okay, so. Darn it. Well, I'm leading, but I think.
Do you want to go with that guess, or do you want to hear the choices?
Can you give me can I get something extra out of? Can I make up for some past buzzes?
Yeah, if you want to do a double ding. If you're wrong, I'll tell you this: you'll get a double buzz.
Oh God, does a double buzz like when I'm down in Los Angeles? You're going to like wire a car battery up to some
There's no all right. You've been reading too much noir. There's no physical term. No, I won't give you a double. I won't give you a double buzz. I will say that if you're confident with your choice, that was one of my choices.
Okay, give me the. Okay, no, I'm not gonna. I have shown that I am basically I bat 100 in trivia, so I don't need to be swinging for the fences.
All right, so A, the $10,000 note with a portrait of Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury in the 1860s. B, the $50,000 note with a portrait of Theodore Roosevelt. C, the $100,000 banknote with a portrait of Woodrow Wilson. Or D, the $1 million banknote with a portrait of Louis Wu, space traveler.
God damn it. So it's not $1 million. You know what? For my
you were wise in listening to the multiple choice.
God damn it. Okay, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000.
Yep.
I know that I very often reason myself out of this. I don't think Woodrow Wilson rates high enough in order to. Well, maybe does he? Do we credit Wilson with winning World War I? Gotta go with Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, you were so close. It's Woodrow Wilson, $100,000 banknote.
Damn it.
Yes. Woodrow Wilson was a revered president until pretty recently, until everybody realized how racist he was. But yes, he was credited with winning World War I and forming the League of Nations.
Yeah, but he's also in the goddamn club of alliterative presidents around the Great Depression. And so we're like, You're like, who was it? Herbert Hoover? Who is like, no, is like saddled with it.
Hoover is the one who tends to get saddled.
And then maybe Calvin Coolidge, who is all there's this like weird.
There's another one in there too. It's like Coolidge, somebody, Hoover. Probably Coolidge had more to do with the Depression than Hoover did. But Hoover, I think a fair critique of Hoover is that he didn't marshal enough, forces to get us out of the Depression. And Roosevelt basically soaked the rich in order to fund all of those New Deal programs, and Hoover wasn't willing to do that. And so the economy was growing, but not fast enough. But Hoover is often blamed for the Depression. I think that's unfair.
Because he was just the guy there when it started.
He was there when the stock market crashed.
Right.
He was a great civil engineer. I believe he engineered the Boulder Dam, which is sometimes referred to as Hoover Dam.
Right. Yes. Well, okay. I was close as usual. Talked myself out of it. So.
I was rooting for you,
Thank
too.
you.
I was like, oh, that's good logic. Yes. Say it.
I also went for, of course, I was looking for a Larry Niven bit to finish up mine. But turns out that Larry Niven didn't write a bunch of like fictional publications into the Ringworld books or any of his books, because which of these august publications called Philip Marlowe amoral, an epithet that infuriated Chandler, more because he felt that the magazine wasn't getting the definition of amoral correct. Was it A, Time, B, The New Yorker, C, The Atlantic, D, Harper's Magazine, and E, the as of yet undiscovered publication in Larry Niven's Ringworld novels. I was like, does Beowulf Schaefer read any magazines on his way to...
Time, The New Yorker... what was the third one?
The Atlantic, and then Harper's is D.
I don't really know much about what the Atlantic and Harper's was like in the 50s or 60s when Raymond Chandler was writing. I just feel like whoever would have been writing for the New Yorker then would be smart enough not to call Marlowe amoral. I could be wrong about that. I don't really think Marlowe is amoral. I think he's a deeply moral person in an amoral world. So I'm going to guess Time for that reason, because that's about the level of analysis I would expect from a Time book review.
You got it. Nice work. And I think your reading of the New Yorker is completely right.
Like A.J. Liebling wouldn't refer to Marlowe as amoral. He would refer to him as probably the way I just did.
Yeah.
You know, a man who's too moral for the world.
He's a moral man in an immoral world. And
right. Let's go watch some boxing.
And eat some oysters. Can we have some oysters?
Well, so everybody, next up is the second half of this book, The Long Goodbye. And this is kicking off our noir series. What's coming up after this is Red Harvest?
Yeah, we're gonna do Red Harvest.
If you want to start reading in
Dashiell Hammett, which is a slender little 200-page novel. It's gonna read a little bit quicker than The Long Goodbye.
Hammett, I've read some Hammett. He's more efficient in his writing than Chandler. They're both good writers, but they have different styles. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. Upper Middlebrow is a small point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes will go to jail before giving up a client. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. We are supported by Jenny Grieve and, well, that's it for now. But if you want to become our second patron, search for us on Patreon or check the show notes for a link.
You can learn more about us and Upper Middlebrow and find our listener survey. We're still taking entries at uppermiddlebrow.com. And please review us in your podcast app, which really helps other people find the show. A rating and a review goes a long way. And if you're enjoying it, please share the show with somebody else. We would really like to reach a wider audience. As a final reminder, Jesse and I are both writers and editors, and we are happy to help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbagg.com and jessedukes.com.
We won't help you get away from the scene of a murder, but if you need somebody to help write your confession and edit it, we'll help with that.
We take all legal tender, including $5,000 notes from before 1969.
That would be wonderful. I would love to be paid in a $5,000 Portrait of Madison note.